So what's this exposure triangle we've been hearing so much about? Is it scary? Is it difficult? Is it important? No, no, yes! In that order. Hi, Greg Lewis, Orange Frog Photography. Hey, you've probably heard about the exposure triangle. Boom, boom, boom. I've talked about it myself plenty of times. A lot of other photographers' videos will talk about it. And until you understand what it is, by the way, it's not that difficult to understand, but until you understand what it is, you're never really going to be able to take your camera out of auto mode. And until you do that, you're really never going to have the creative control that you so desire in your photography. So let's talk about that. Now, we all know what a triangle is, but what's this exposure thing? Well, exposure is just a fancy photographer term for brightness and darkness. If a picture is too light, it's overexposed. If a picture is too dark, it's underexposed. And if a picture is just right, it's properly exposed. And this is subjective. To say a picture is absolutely too dark or absolutely too bright is completely up to you. You have control of that, but you have to know how to control that. Your camera is always going to try to use its computer brain to get everything perfectly exposed, and it'll use whatever means necessary. And those may not be the means that you want. So let's talk about that for a moment. Okay, so you may recall that your camera uses three things to control exposure. That's why it's called the exposure triangle. There are three things. One is shutter speed, one is ISO, and one is f-stops. Now, in addition to controlling the light that's coming into your camera or how sensitive it is to that light, these things also control, in each of their own, another thing. Shutter speed controls the motion or the ability to capture motion. ISO controls how sensitive the sensor is on your camera. And f-stop controls the size of the aperture in your camera, so that says how much depth of field, how much it will be in focus. All right? So let's focus a little bit right now on just exposure and kind of ignore those other things. So let's talk about how these things interact with one another when you're trying to get proper exposure.
So now, through the magic of PowerPoint, we're going to talk about how f-stop, shutter speed, and ISO interact with one another to affect the exposure of your picture. And here you see you have a perfectly exposed subject of a roguishly handsome yet somehow familiar young man who has his priorities in order. And for whatever reason, you want to increase the f-stops, which is fine. That's your prerogative. But you'll notice when you do that, now the image is underexposed or too dark, because remember, if you move one thing, you have to move another thing to compensate for it. So when you moved f-stop up, you decreased the aperture in your lens. That's letting less light in. So now to compensate for that, you have to move something else. In this case, let's try shutter speed. So now we made the shutter speed a little bit slower, so it could compensate for the f-stops going up. They've come together to make a properly exposed picture. So let's say now you want to adjust your ISO. Take it down. Well, take it up. When you take ISO up, you increase the sensitivity of your camera's sensor, and now the image is overexposed, so you have to take something else away from that. In this case, let's bring the shutter speed back a little faster. Now the exposure's right. So does that make sense? Whenever you move one of these three things, so far as exposure is concerned, you have to move one of the other things to compensate for it. Okay, so I should probably point out right now what is meant by stops. I don't mean f-stops, I mean stops. Now, you'll notice these little increments on each of these dials, or each of the boop, 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 boop. What is that? It's not a dial, it's a doesn't matter. And what a stop essentially is saying is when you move one of these, you're either doubling or halving the amount of light that's coming into your camera. Let's not get too bogged down into that, but it's good to understand when me or any photographer refers to stops or moving it up a stop, they're talking about halving or doubling the intensity of light. And by clicking one of these, so generally speaking, if you go up 4 stops on f-stops, you have to go down 4 stops with your shutter speed to compensate. They equalize out in very specific measurements. So that's a good thing to remember when you're adjusting these. So if you go 4 clicks, 1, 2, 3, with shutter speed, then you go 4 clicks the other opposite direction with f-stops, right? That's not too hard to remember when you think of it in those terms. Now let's move on to a real-world scenario.
Okay, so now we understand basically what exposure triangle means and what it is, and that you have to compensate when you lift it or decrease one setting by lifting or decreasing another setting. Okay, so let's try that in a more or less real-world situation. First, a few things I should point out. This is a super old camera. It's like 10 years old, and I'm using it for 2 reasons. One, to show you that you don't need a new fancy camera to do this. Any modern DSLR, SLR, mirrorless camera will do everything I'm about to tell you. Not so much the little point and shoots, but even some of those do as well. All right, so another reason is I'm filming this on my proper camera, so I'm using my old backup camera. All right, so here's the setting. You have a dog. We'll call him Ty, because that's what his tag says, because apparently Mimi thinks that someday Ty stuffed animals will be valuable and she wants to keep the tag on it. And you have a dog house. And in this first example, you want to take a picture such that the dog and the house are both properly exposed and in focus. Now, you might remember from another video and from this video to some degree, in order to get a broader depth of field, you have to have a higher f-stop, right? So the f-stop on this lens goes to f22. I've currently got it set to f16. That should give us plenty of, room to do that. So let's go ahead and take that shot. All right, and you can see that it's well exposed and everything's in focus. That was easy. Now let's say your subject is tired of sitting there and wants to move around a little bit. Okay, now you still want him to be properly exposed, and you want him to be not blurry and moving around. So if you take a picture right now, not having moved anything, now he's blurry because your shutter speed is down at 1/3 of a second. So that's way too slow. In this case, I want to take, and I know that the shutter speed to capture motion for the doggy is going to be about 1/125ths a second. All right, so we'll take that up. That was about 12 clicks. And get the focus again. See, he's moved a little bit. All right, now let's swing him around a little bit and take the picture. Oh no, it's black. Well, of course it's black, because all we did was move the shutter speed and we didn't do anything else. We didn't do anything else to compensate for it. So I'm going to put this down because it's really clicking and I'm sure it's picking up on the audio. So now we have a couple things we can do. We can either move down the f-stop or move up the ISO. Well, let's in this situation move down the f-stop. So we'll take it down 12 clicks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Say f-stop 2.0. That's almost as low as this lens can go. Okay, now let's take that picture. See? And if you want to get his butt, boom. Okay, so now it's properly exposed and he is not blurry, but now the background is not in focus anymore. And remember at the beginning you said, well, I want the background to be in focus as well as the subject. What do I do now? Let's move the f-stop back to, 16, right? So now we know that the full thing is going to be in focus because the depth of field is sufficient. So let's take that picture. Oh no, it's too dark. Of course it's dark because we've explained several times you can't move one thing without moving another. Well, you can't move the shutter speed because it'll just make it darker if you make it faster. So the only thing you have left to do is to take the ISOs up to let more light in. Now, that's going to cause a problem, possibly because the ISOs on the low light photography on this particular camera is not great, but let's see how it goes. So take ISO, and we're going to take it up 5, 6 stops. Now remember, ISOs on this camera are full increments, while everything is half increments, so you have to double or half or whatever. It gets confusing. Just remember, when one goes up, one has to go down until the meter tells you it's properly exposed. So now let's go ahead and look at that. Okay, so what have we learned? Well, we've learned that to take control of the situation, you have to control your camera. Your camera could never have known whether he just looks so sad. He looks so sad, just dangling there. Okay. So your camera could never have known what you wanted to accomplish. It couldn't have known if you wanted the dog to be still. It just tries to get a proper exposure any way it can. It didn't know if you wanted the background in focus. It didn't know if you wanted to sacrifice a little grain by pushing up the ISOs because you wanted both. It doesn't know. You know that, and you have to control that in your camera, and that's why you have to put it in manual mode. But you don't have to put it in manual mode straight away, or really ever, for a lot of situations. Remember, your camera also has aperture priority, which means you can set the aperture, and then the camera will take care of all the other stuff. And insofar as it can, it'll push up the ISOs and the shutter speed to compensate and take a properly exposed picture that works for you and for what you had in mind. Your camera also does shutter priority, which means you set the shutter speed to catch the action you want, and your camera more or less takes care of everything else. And you can also, no matter what mode you're in, put your camera's ISO on automatic. So just remember, you take control of the camera, and it's not that hard, but it does take practice. You just got to do it a little bit, and then it becomes boom, boom, boom. You don't even have to think about it. You go, oh, I know I want to capture that action, so I've got to push up the shutter speed. And you go, oh, I know I want more depth of field, so I've got to open up, the f-stops, or take the f-stops down to open up that aperture to give me less depth of field if I want a blurry background. So that's really all there is to it. Okay, that's about it. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. And if you have any snarky comments, knock yourself out. If you have any positive comments, knock yourself out. I'm open to any sort of comments you have. Also, please, of course, make sure you subscribe and click the bell thingy. Bing! So whenever we make new videos, you'll be notified of them. Thank you so much, and stay focused.